What's going on, my dudes? It's Ben, Forgotten Media, and today we've got 5 tips for better music photography. Now, you could argue that music photography is one of the hardest forms of photography. You've got low light, fast moving subjects, high dynamic range, smoke, lasers, pretty much lots of things that cameras hate. Combined with the fact that you've usually only got 3 songs and then you're out, the pressure can really be on to make sure that you get the best shot. Saying that, for me, it's one of the most rewarding forms of photography. You don't really have much control over your scene, so when you do get a good shot, it feels all the more worth it. So right now, I'm going to share with you 5 things that I wish I knew when I first started doing music photography. Tip number 1 is shoot fast. When we refer to a lens as fast, we're referring to the aperture. So a wider aperture is going to let more light in. Apertures like 1.4, 1.8, 2 and 2.8 are really going to help you get a lot more light onto your sensor. This right here is the Canon 50mm 1.8, aka the Nifty 50. This is such an important lens. You could pick these up for around £100 and will really help you get used to shooting at wider apertures. This is an incredible lens and comes with me pretty much everywhere I go. Now, tip number 2 is shoot fast. This time we're referring to the shutter speed. Now we're getting more light into the camera by opening up the aperture. We need to deal with those fast moving subjects. As I'm sure most of you have seen, by leaving the shutter open a little too long, you get a blurred, messy image. If you want to freeze that motion, you've got to get the shutter open and closed nice and quickly before your subject has had a chance to move. Now, this is personal to everyone, but I personally very rarely shoot slower than 1/200th of a second. There are of course exceptions to this rule, but generally it's rare if I'm shooting slower than that. Now, tip number 3 is try and keep your ISO low. Now we've set our shutter speed and our aperture, we have to make sure the image is bright enough or properly exposed. The issue with ISO is that the higher you go, especially on like lower end cameras, the more grainy the image is, which means in Photoshop or Lightroom, you're going to have less flexibility to edit the image. Almost all cameras have got an exposure indicator, either here or here. This will give you a really good idea of how much light you're letting in. When it's in the middle, you've got a pretty good chance that your image is going to be exposed properly. I generally tend to aim somewhere about -1. I find that gives me enough room in Lightroom to push the exposure a little bit higher. With tools built into Lightroom like the denoiser, you can clean the image up a fair bit, but in my opinion, it's better to start with a cleaner image. Over the course of a show, it's pretty much the only value that I'll change. It really pays to know where your ISO button is. So when you're looking down the viewfinder, you can tap that and then dial the ISO up and down, keeping an eye on your exposure indicator to make sure that you're getting the right exposure. Tip number 4 is shoot manual. This is going to give you the best control over your camera settings. Auto is great when you're developing to take a photo and then go back in Lightroom and have a look at the settings the camera chose. In low light settings with lots of moving lights, fast moving subjects and lots of smoke around, it can play havoc with the camera's settings, and it's not guaranteed it's always going to choose the best settings for that particular scenario. Experiment with your camera. Turn things up and down and see how they affect the image. Learn what settings do what. And eventually, as you start to learn those, you can pretty much look at a scene and start to dial those numbers in before you've even taken a photo. As I said before, pretty much the only value I change during a show is my ISO. And by learning where all these buttons are, allows me to really quickly adjust my exposure as I go. Finally, tip number 5 is back button focus. Autofocus is amazing, especially on cameras like the 5D and the 1DX. Sometimes that can grab focus on something that I can't even see through the viewfinder. I'm awful at manual focusing. By the time I've got a subject in focus, they've moved and I'm back at square one. Composition is super important, but your subject isn't always going to be front and center of your image. Although you do have focus points that you can use the little joystick on the back to select, it's not always practical to do so. That is where back button focus really comes in. With most Canon cameras out the box, half pressing the shutter release button starts the focusing process. Once the camera's found the thing to focus on, you hear this beep, and then you can release the shutter. With back button focus, this button here takes over the role of the half press. When you press that button, your camera's going to start focusing on whatever your focus point is over. Once you release that button, your camera's focus will stay locked and you can release the shutter as many times as you like. When it's time to refocus, you hold the button, you track your subject, release the back button, and then release the shutter. What I've found for more unique compositions is to release the button and then recompose my image and fire the shutter release. After a while, it just becomes muscle memory to track your subject, release, recompose, shoot. Release, recompose, shoot. I was shooting for nearly a year until someone told me that. Thanks, Owen. And now it's become pretty much my go-to setting as soon as I get a new camera. And they were my 5 tips for better live music photography. Now, I'm not saying this is the only way to take photos of bands. It's about finding a formula that works for you and developing that. Everyone has their own style and their own flavour, and the only way to find that is for you to get out there and practice. Message bands on Facebook, find bands that are playing locally. You generally find they're pretty receptive if you ask to take photos of them. Comment below with any tips or tricks that work for you. Hit like if you liked what you saw, and remember to subscribe. Thanks for watching. I've been Ben from Forgotten Media. Peace.